earlier today was CD Projekt Red's Q3 2021 earnings call. And during this call, they talk a bit about Cyberpunk 2077 itself, but they also do have a Q&A section where investors asked a bunch of questions about the future of this game and the company overall. I would actually say this was one of the most interesting earnings calls they've given in a while. They reveal a lot of very interesting things, specifically about the future plans and incoming updates for Cyberpunk, and at least some of what that's all going to entail, including some interesting notes on the expansions and perhaps when we are or aren't getting them. So in this video, I went through the call, took out some of the most interesting things, and repackaged all of the information to hopefully make it a bit more digestible. And with that, starting things off, let's first look at some of the things they just stated about Cyberpunk, how they opened up the call overall. They mentioned how since launch, Cyberpunk has been significantly improved, which is reflected in the Steam reviews. If you haven't seen over the past couple of days, the Steam reviews for Cyberpunk have been overwhelmingly positive, with a huge influx of new players from the Steam sale and a huge influx of additional positive reviews from those new players. But although they kind of take that moment to recognize that things are definitely improving with the game, they also mentioned they are still working hard to improve the experience on every platform. They do emphasize that every platform note. But since things are improving, this also does mean that more people are being moved to work on other projects, and notably the Cyberpunk expansions. To give us another employee breakdown so you can see how things are evolving over time, where the various employees are being allocated. And what we're seeing is less people on the next gen as well as the updates for Cyberpunk, more people on the expansions, to now where they're about even. It almost looks like there's about an equal amount of people working on the expansion as well as working on the current game and the next gen version. And they talk quite a bit about the next gen version. They have some very interesting things to share. They mention how the next gen version will be shipped with the next big update, and reiterate how the next gen version is going to be totally free. We saw earlier this year how they quietly updated their roadmap, functionally delaying all of the updates into next year, and it really seems like the strategy here is the next gen version is going to be a relaunch of the game, and patch 1.5, which will ship with the next gen version, is going to be this rather large scale update that is thoroughly bug tested and hopefully performs pretty well and seems to add in some new things. The next gen version will have both graphical updates and system level improvements. They don't get too explicit on what these system level improvements are, but they describe them as systems that are general to the game, how it's not a revolution but still central to the game, so they want extra time to test this for Cyberpunk, and that's a bit of the reason why the next gen update was delayed. As I mentioned before, the next gen version of this game will ship with the 1.5 update. You might be thinking, wait, what happened to 1.4? Right now we're in version 1.31, the last major version was 1.3, and they basically say that they are skipping version 1.4 to just have a nice round number when the next gen update ships to really showcase how important that update is. So it's going to go from patch 1.31 to patch 1.5, because 5 apparently is more commanding than a 4. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, but I just found this whole thing to be kind of funny, how they are literally just skipping the number 4. And all info they are receiving from both of these next gen projects, with both Cyberpunk as well as with The Witcher 3, do say that the next gen versions are on track. So Q1 2022 for Cyberpunk, Q2 2022 for The Witcher 3's next gen version. And they allude a bit more to what this update slash next gen version might entail, and how it does contain some improvements and changes in general to these systems, and how right now with the next gen version they are testing the game to make sure it is in a good state and well polished. So it seems like the next gen version may be largely feature complete, or all the things they wanted to add are complete, and right now they're really in a testing phase, likely because again they are treating this almost like a relaunch and they want to make sure things are right, not buggy like the original release. And between these comments here, with the next gen version and this next update kind of being in a testing or bug fixing phase, and the comments a few days ago about how the next gen version was delayed largely because the developers said it wasn't ready yet, gives me quite a bit of hope that this will actually deliver and be pretty good. But then they also talk a bit about what's to come after the next gen version, and this is where things get pretty interesting. He talks about how sentiment of Cyberpunk is key in the near future, and it seems like a lot of this is riding on this next gen version and the update 1.5 coming out, and how people respond to that. They're going to look at their strategy plans and talk about them, but only after this all releases. And they do say how the future isn't necessarily set in stone. They very much so are planning to release this next update and then look at the data, look at the player response, and then they're going to evaluate that and determine how to move forward. It's not totally clear what this all means, how this will impact things like expansions, or maybe which direction they go in the future, or what is kind of up in the air, maybe just how much more effort they have to put into bug fixing and patching versus how much they could focus on new content. I imagine that's a big consideration expansion going forward, but it's interesting. It really seems like there is, again, a lot riding on this. They even just kind of refer to it as almost a new game coming out at one point. Then we get a really interesting back and forth around the expansion release date. As somebody does directly ask, is the expansion coming in 2022? Can you give any guidance on that? And CDPR gives a very kind of corporately correct answer, how they haven't said anything on dates or scope of the expansion, so they don't want to pre-announce that. And very obviously, they didn't confirm a 2022 release date. And if you look at some of the roadmaps, the expansions coming in 2022 has never really been confirmed. It's been this talking point a lot of us have kind of considered, we've looked at, but it does make me wonder what if the expansions don't actually come in 2022? It's not confirmed here one way or another, but it just was an interesting thing to consider. They also talk a bit about multiplayer and what their plans with multiplayer are going forward. And I found their answer around this to be really interesting, so I want to play the snippet so you can actually hear it for yourself, and then we'll dive into what they say.
So we are planning to add multiplayer functionalities in the future to both franchises, including Cyberpunk, gradually. So, and we are not revealing which franchise will get the first multiplayer functionalities, but the first attempt will be something we can learn from, and then we can add more and more. So step by step, we want to open our single player experience. We want to open doors to multiplayer, but adding some multiplayer activities gradually.
So to kind of just reiterate, to me it sounds like he basically says, okay, they have plans to add multiplayer to both of their franchises, Cyberpunk and The Witcher, and Cyberpunk won't necessarily be the first franchise to get multiplayer functionality, which would imply that The Witcher could be the first franchise to get multiplayer functionality, which does that mean we could see multiplayer support in a gradual or kind of built up over time way with The Witcher 3? Perhaps I'm reading way too deeply into this, but I just found the quote to be really interesting. I knew multiplayer was coming to Cyberpunk, but I just kind of always assumed it would be the first game by CDPR to get multiplayer, and then they might gradually add it to other games in the future. They described in the past how they kind of have carved out a section of their studio that is kind of just working on multiplayer aspects for games, and it'll probably always be a thing going forward. So I assumed with Cyberpunk 2077 and The Witcher 4. But I hadn't seriously considered them adding it to The Witcher 3 first, but in hindsight, that could be a huge hit if done correctly. Either way, pretty interesting. Again, maybe I'm reading way too deeply into that. That's why I wanted to play the direct quote for you guys to hear. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. In addition, we also do have a bit of talk on the Molasses Flood. This is a studio they recently acquired that is working on one of CD Projekt Red's franchises. They describe how currently they're working on a game. It's in the design phase very early on. We don't know if that franchise is The Witcher or Cyberpunk. They describe how they're working very closely with the Molasses Flood, and then he goes on about how they have a special expertise, and it almost sounds like he was going to say that what they're working on is tied to their special expertise, but then he cuts himself off. Considering they did recently release a co-op game, makes me wonder, are they actually working on some kind of co-op functionality with The Witcher 3? If not, some of their other special expertise is clearly Unreal Engine. They have a distinctive art style, typically having a survival element in their games. I'm not super sure how this art style could fit in with Cyberpunk or The Witcher, but it is interesting. I'm definitely curious to see what they're working on. This kind of marks 3 separate games. CDPR confirmed earlier in the year that going forward, they're going to be working on 2 AAA games in tandem, and that has already begun at the studio. But they confirm here that whatever the Molasses Flood is working on is separate. So 2 AAA games in tandem, the Molasses Flood project, as well as their other existing projects. They mention how a lot of the work on their next AAA game, the one they're working on in tandem with Cyberpunk, is still early stages, but after the next-gen update does release, that there'll probably be more people working on the other AAA game. They talk a bit about changing the price. Obviously, there's a bunch of sales for Black Friday with Cyberpunk, but they have no plans to change the price of the game in the future. They reiterate again that first and foremost, they need to bring back good sentiment around the game, but when expansions or other things happen, we could see price changes. They also do mention how they don't think Cyberpunk 2077 is in a stage of its life where it would be added to a subscription service. There's a question on Game Pass. There's even just some recent rumors of Cyberpunk coming to Game Pass. It seems like that is definitely not happening, or at least not right now. And lastly, not directly related to Cyberpunk or even The Witcher, but it seems like GOG, their storefront, has been having some financial financial difficulties. It didn't post a profit for the past quarter. They mentioned how they're actually restructuring it somewhat, really going to focus on that core business of hand-selected games that are DRM free for their storefront. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve with that going forward. But overall, again, I thought this was really interesting. It seems like the future of Cyberpunk is somewhat undecided. And this isn't in the sense that they aren't going to be working on future updates for this game, because it still seems like they are committed to supporting it. This is a franchise they are sticking with, but I imagine perhaps where their efforts are focused more specifically, whether it be on fixing things or new content or some other thing I'm not aware of. And a lot of that's going to be determined in the next few months when we actually get that next gen version. So definitely an interesting one. If you guys enjoyed this, you can get subscribed. I have a few more Cyberpunk videos planned, actually on some mods, as well as some other interesting in-game stuff. But with that said, as always, again, I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.